Rain pattered softly against the cabin's tin roof, a gentle lullaby echoing through the boundless Alaskan wilderness. The cabin, perched on the edge of a broad, winding river, was nearly hidden by the towering spruce and aspen that blanketed the region in shaggy green. Far from any paved road, this remote homestead was home to 50-year-old Hank Bellamy, a quietly spoken man who had devoted much of his adult life to living in harmony with nature. On this particular morning, however, Hank was more restless than usual. His gaze lingered on the battered wooden trunk that stood by the far wall, a repository for old journals, photographs, and cherished mementos. Among them lay a small leather collar, once fastened around the neck of an orphaned bear cub he had raised as his own. 10 years earlier, Hank had been in the same part of Alaska, near the boundaries of Katmai National Park, famous for its dense population of brown bears who feast each summer on the salmon runs. At the time, Hank had worked seasonally as a guide, helping scientists from the Point use geological survey track animal movements. One afternoon, during a routine check of wildlife camera traps, he found a tiny bear cub curled in the underbrush, mewling in distress. Its fur was wet from the persistent drizzle. No mother bear appeared nearby. Hank knew the region well enough to suspect that a sow might have died or been driven off, leaving the cub defenseless. Normally, he would have contacted park rangers and let them handle the orphan, but the cub was painfully small, with wide, frightened eyes and a haunting cry that felt heartbreakingly human in its desperation. With no immediate sign of the mother, Hank knew the cub's odds of survival were slim. Alaskan nights, even in summer, could be unforgivingly cold for a baby without the heat of its mother's body. Hank carried a satellite phone for emergencies, but at that particular spot he had no signal. The nearest ranger station was miles away. Dusk had already begun stretching purple fingers across the sky, and the temperature was plummeting. The cub, trembling with hunger and terror, stared at Hank through half-lidded eyes. It let out a weak moan. He couldn't bring himself to walk away. Guiding the tip of a gloved finger across the cub's tiny flank, Hank felt the sharp ridges of its ribcage. It was starved. Against all reason, he decided to bring it back to his modest cabin rather than leave it alone to certain death. Later, he would contact the rangers properly, but for now, ensuring the cub's immediate survival took precedence. Gently, he placed it inside his jacket, feeling its small body press against his chest. Hiking home with the cub took hours, and with each step, Hank wondered if he was doing the right thing. He had no illusions about how dangerous bears could be once grown. He respected that wilderness demanded a careful balance between humans and animals. Still, the baby's plaintive cries stirred a paternal instinct Hank had never known he possessed. By the time he reached his cabin, the cub was nearly unconscious from exhaustion. Hank nursed it back, with warm goat's milk unconventional, but the best he could manage out here. In the flickering glow of a single lantern, he watched the cub regain some energy, eventually falling asleep on a pile of thick blankets. Even at that young age, the small bear's fur was a distinctive burnished brown, flecked with darker tips that hinted it might one day grow into a large, regal adult. "Welcome to your new home, for now," Hank murmured, more to himself than to the sleeping cub. The wind outside moaned softly, as though echoing his words. Although Hank fully intended to hand the cub over to professional care as soon as possible, the days stretched into a week. A fierce storm front battered the region, leaving roads washed out and radio communication unreliable. Ranger stations advised travelers to remain where they were, if safe. Cabin bound with his unlikely charge, Hank couldn't resist forging a bond. He named the cub Bo, after his late grandfather Bowen, who had once taught him the importance of kindness toward all creatures. Slowly, Bo's strength blossomed. Each day, Hank fed him a special mixture of formula, carefully measuring out nutrients to mirror what a sow's milk might provide. The bear's fuzzy coat thickened, its eyes grew bright, and tiny claws emerged from soft paws. To keep Bo's budding instincts healthy, Hank placed logs inside the cabin for the cub to climb, letting it test its grip and practice innate behaviors. When the sun broke through the clouds, he led Bo outside, guiding him through the meadow behind the cabin. Hank kept watch for any sign of a mother bear, just in case a sow had survived and was searching for her lost cub. But none appeared. Days turned to weeks. The storm damage delayed official help, and by the time park rangers finally reached Hank's cabin, Bo had not only survived, but thrived under Hank's care. At first, the rangers were alarmed. Ordinarily, it was park policy to transfer orphaned cubs to a licensed facility, such as the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center near Portage. But Bo had already developed a bond with Hank, a bond so strong that forcibly removing the cub to a crowded rescue center, amid countless other animals, might undermine the progress he'd made. After lengthy discussions and with special permits secured, the authorities allowed Hank to keep raising Bo under the strict condition that he collaborate with a wildlife biologist to ensure the cub's eventual release. Over the next 2 years, life took on a new rhythm for Hank. Dawn came early in the Alaskan summers, and he'd rise to the sound of Bo's enthusiastic snuffling. By then, the bear cub was walking confidently on sturdy legs, rummaging around the kitchen for scraps left on the counter if Hank forgot to secure them. Daily, Hank took Bo exploring in the forest, teaching him how to find wild berries, dig for edible roots, and fish in the shallow streams. Though the mechanics of fishing often flustered Bo, his little paws swiping at darting salmon, Hank sensed the cub's natural instincts flickering alive. The simple presence of a paternal figure, albeit human, helped guide Bo's introduction to the environment. But raising a bear cub was no idyllic fantasy. It came with physical demands and emotional turmoil. The older Bo grew, the more powerful he became. Even at a young age, a playful swat could leave Hank with bruises. Each time Bo sent him sprawling, Hank felt a jolt of reality. This was a wild animal destined to roam free, not a perpetual pet. Those nights, Hank would lie awake, heart pounding, grappling with the knowledge that soon he would have to let Bo go. Nonetheless, the bond between them ran deep. Hank found that caring for Bo filled an empty space in his life, a loneliness that had lodged in his chest ever since he left a teaching job years before and retreated to the Alaskan wilderness. At times, he'd read aloud from his old college textbooks, half-jokingly teaching Bo about biology and conservation, as though the bear might absorb some faint echo of human language. Bo, for his part, followed Hank around like an oversized dog, padding gently beside him. He listened curiously to the man's ramblings, tilting his head whenever Hank spoke. When Hank's mood was low, the bear would sometimes rest his chin on Hank's knee, letting out a soft huff as if to offer comfort. In these quiet moments, the human-animal bond felt transcendent, an ancient connection bridging the gap between species. As Bo neared his second birthday, the reality of releasing him into the wild pressed down more heavily. Katmai National Park staff strongly recommended that Bo be returned before he grew too accustomed to human presence. They feared he might become a habituated bear, more prone to dangerous encounters with unsuspecting tourists or poachers. Hank understood this all too well. A half-tame bear in the wild often met a tragic fate. So, in collaboration with the park's lead wildlife biologist, Dr. Carolyn Wu, Hank designed a transition plan. They sought out a suitable territory deep in the park, far from main visitor trails. Gradually, They would reduce Bo's contact with humans and teach him to forage without human assistance. The final stage would involve Hank saying a painful farewell, trusting that the 2 years of guided growth had instilled enough survival skills for Bo to make his own way among the rivers and forests of Katmai. The day arrived on a crisp morning, the sun glinting off the water droplets that clung to pine needles. Hank and Dr. Wu guided Bo into a special transport crate, reassuring the bear with low, calm voices. Though now the size of a large dog, Bo entered the crate without much struggle, as if sensing Hank's intentions. The drive toward the designated release site felt unbearably long. Bo occasionally let out a distressed moan from the back of the truck. Each sound tore at Hank's heart. When they reached a secluded stretch of forest near a winding river, they cut the engine. Hank could hardly breathe as he unlatched the crate door. In that moment, Bo hesitated, as if torn between stepping into freedom and clinging to the only parental figure he'd known. Hank knelt by the open crate. "It's time, buddy," he whispered. "Go on now. This is your world." Bo stepped out onto the mossy ground, turning his head to glance at Hank one last time. The morning sun lit up the gold flecks in his coat. Hank felt tears burn the back of his eyes. No words could capture the gravity of that moment, the wrenching mix of pride, sorrow, and hope. Bo huffed softly, then lumbered off into the trees, rounding a bend until he vanished from sight. Hank stayed there, kneeling on the ground, as though anchored by heartbreak. "Doctor," Wu placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You gave him a chance at life," she murmured. "That's more than many orphaned cubs get." Indeed, that was a consolation, but it didn't fully mend the sudden void Bo's absence left behind. After Dr. Wu drove him back, Hank returned to his cabin alone. Life went on. Hank resumed his seasonal work as a guide, then later as a ranger for Katmai, helping visitors safely observe the famed brown bears during salmon runs. He also taught courses at a local outdoor education center in the small town of King Salmon, transferring the lessons he'd learned from raising Bo. Over time, he channeled his longing and love for the orphaned cub into activism, rallying for stricter protections against illegal hunting and habitat destruction. 10 years slipped by in a tide of memories. Hank aged, streaks of silver crept into his hair, and the lines around his eyes deepened. He sometimes wondered if Bo was even alive. Bears faced many perils, from the harsh Alaskan winters to rival males, from human encroachment to scarce food sources. The best Hank could do was quietly trust in the resilience he had seen in that small, frightened cub all those years ago. Occasionally, in the quiet hours before dawn, Hank remembered how Bo had rested his chin on his knee, how the bear had blinked those soulful eyes as if trying to understand him. He'd imagined Bo as a full-grown Katmai brown bear, prowling the salmon-laden rivers, powerful and free. The thought gave him solace. Then came the morning that would change everything. A Park Service colleague mentioned a recent sighting, a large brown bear with an unusual distinct marking, a patch of darker fur across his right shoulder, spotted near the old meadow by Hank's off-grid cabin. The sighting was fleeting, but the bear had shown no aggression toward a passing hiker, merely stood watching from afar, unthreatened by the human presence. Curiosity bloomed in Hank's chest. Could it be Bo? The description of the distinctive marking matched the pattern Bo had on his right side when he was a cub. Yet it had been a decade. Bears roam widely, and identifying them by memory alone was a gamble. Still, the spark of possibility tugged at him, urging him to return to the cabin in hopes of glimpsing the animal. One golden afternoon, Hank packed supplies and set out across a gravel road that gradually gave way to a winding dirt track, eventually funneling him into the remote corner of the park he once called home. The final mile he traveled on foot, stepping over rotting logs and through tangles of salmonberry bushes. Memories of carrying a tiny cub in his arms flooded back. By the time he saw the familiar silhouette of his old cabin, his heart pounded with both nostalgia and an inexplicable sense of destiny. The place was as he remembered, small, rustic, but cozy against the backdrop of towering spruce. Late-day sunlight streamed through the ragged clearing where he and Bo had once roamed together. Hank unlocked the creaking door, stepping into the stale air. Dust motes danced in the beams of light. The cabin felt eerily still, as though it had been frozen in time, waiting for him to return. That evening, Hank lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, rummaging through the trunk for some canned beans and the battered kettle he used to boil water. Outside, the wind teased the cabin's eaves. He wondered if the rumored bear might appear, half expecting to hear heavy footfalls or snorting near the door. But the night passed quietly, with only the distant yip of a fox echoing through the forest. Hank dozed in the cabin's single chair, a swirl of hopeful dreams carrying him through the darkness. Dawn arrived in a wash of pale grey. Hank, stiff-necked from sleeping in the chair, ventured outside for fresh air. He paused on the porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots, and scanned the meadow. A light mist clung to the waist-high grass. The morning hush felt profound, as though nature held its breath. Then a dark shape materialized near the tree line. The shape moved with a slow, deliberate gait. Hank's pulse hammered. He squinted, trying to discern details in the dawn's dim light. The figure ambled into the meadow, revealing itself as a large brown bear. The tall shoulder hump, the massive paws, the proud stance, it was unmistakably an adult Katmai grizzly. Hank's skin prickled. This bear's fur was a deep, almost auburn brown, but across its right shoulder there lay a swath of darker fur, forming a subtle crescent-like marking. Hank inhaled sharply. That was exactly where Bo's coat had been darkest when he was a cub. Reason told Hank that many bears might share similar patterns, but the longing in his chest told him otherwise. Could he dare believe it was Bo after all these years? Standing on the porch, Hank dared not call out or make any sudden moves. He simply stayed there, letting the crisp morning air fill his lungs. The bear halted, head lifted as it sniffed the air, the two locked eyes across the dewy grass. Despite the distance, Hank sensed a familiarity in the animal's curious gaze, an echo of the bond they'd once shared. Slowly, tentatively, the bear moved closer. Hank's heart thundered so loud, he wondered if the animal could hear it. A swirl of memories welled up, cradling the tiny cub near a crackling fireplace, wading into the shallow stream to show Bo how to splash for salmon. He'd never believed he would experience such an encounter again. 10 feet from the porch, the bear halted. It was a powerful creature, likely weighing hundreds of pounds. Even from that distance, Hank felt the warm rush of its breath in the cool morning air. They stood in silence for what seemed an eternity, man and bear, each shaped by the trials of life, each changed by the passing of a decade. Hank raised a trembling hand, palm outward in a gentle, open gesture. He remembered how, long ago, Bo used to press his wet nose into Hank's open hand, seeking reassurance. His rational mind told him to be cautious. This was a full-grown wild bear, not the cub he once rocked to sleep. Yet, a flicker of trust guided his movements. A soft chuff rumbled from the bear's throat. It took another step. Then, remarkably, it lowered its head, the way a dog might do when sniffing an old friend. Hank was too overcome to speak. He edged forward, descending one step from the porch. The bear snorted, eyes locked on Hank. For a moment, time seemed to fold in on itself. No matter how impossible it seemed, Hank sensed that this was indeed Bo, that the orphaned cub he once raised now stood as a living testament to resilience and the enduring power of a bond formed in adversity. Hank had brought something from the trunk inside, the small leather collar that Bo once wore for a few weeks, back when he was undersized and ill. Of course, Bo had long since outgrown it, but Hank clutched it in trembling fingers. He held it up slightly, as if to show the bear, though he knew it was a sentimental gesture more than anything else. The bear's gaze flitted to the object, then back to Hank's face. He wanted to move closer, to touch the thick fur that had once been silky soft under his palm. But a lifetime of wilderness wisdom kept him from overstepping. Instead, Hank reached out very slowly, stopping inches from the bear's muzzle. If the animal was truly comfortable, it would close the gap. In a moment that felt almost miraculous, the bear leaned forward. Its wet nose brushed Hank's fingertips in a fleeting contact. The creature's powerful body vibrated with a low hum, a series of short huffs that Hank recognized from years ago, vocalizations Bo made when he was content or curious. Tears blurred Hank's vision. The forest, the cabin, the swirl of clouds overhead, all of it seemed to fade away, leaving only this moment. He wasn't foolhardy. He knew the bear could still be dangerous, but the sense of recognition was overwhelming. It was as if the decades fell away, replaced by the ghost of the little cub that used to bumble around the cabin, tumbling after Hank's boots. Through panting breaths, Hank managed to whisper, "Bo, that you, buddy?" The bear sniffed again, the big shoulders rolling under its fur. Then, with a startling gentleness, it nudged Hank's hand aside and brushed its head against Hank's chest. Hank stood motionless, tears streaming. Over and over, the same phrase echoed in his mind, "He made it. He's alive." Despite the odds, Bo had grown into a regal adult. He had come back here, for reasons beyond human comprehension, maybe drawn by old scents, old memories, or simply by the curiosity that had once guided him as a cub. The reunion could not last forever. After a few mesmerizing minutes of quiet contact, the bear backed away. Standing tall on all fours, Bo let out a deep groan that echoed through the clearing. Then he turned, as if summoned by the ancient rhythms of the wilderness, and trotted off into the thick trees. Hank didn't try to follow. He knew that Bo was, and always had been, a wild creature at heart. This was a gift, these final moments of connection. He stood there long after Bo disappeared, letting the morning light wash over him. The weight of the last decade lifted, replaced by a bittersweet fulfillment. Whatever the future held, he knew that somewhere in the vastness of Katmai, the bear he had once saved was thriving. They had shared a bond that not even 10 years of separation could entirely erase. That afternoon, Hank meticulously recorded the encounter in his journal, noting every detail, from the time of day to the bear's distinctive marking. A local ranger friend, upon hearing his account, said, "It sounds like a fairy tale." But she saw the emotion in Hank's eyes, and she saw the prints in the mud near his cabin's meadow. There was no question that a bear had been there, an unusually calm, curious one. In the days that followed, Hank felt a deep peace settle over him. Word of his reunion with Bo quietly spread among some of the park staff, though he kept details sparse to protect the bear's anonymity. He feared that if too many tourists learned of a friendly Katmai grizzly, it might draw the wrong kind of attention. Instead, he treasured the memory in private, cherishing the knowledge that the love and care he offered so freely to a helpless cub had borne fruit in the bear's survival. Of course, life moved on. Hank continued working with the park service, guiding visitors with renewed passion. When asked about the highlights of his time in Alaska, he would sometimes share a cautious version of Bo's story, emphasizing the importance of letting wild animals remain wild. "We humans," he'd say to wide-eyed tourists, "we've got a responsibility. We're visitors here, and once in a while, if we're lucky, we get to see just how much a single act of kindness can change a life." In quiet moments, Hank liked to imagine that Bo was out there, fishing at a bend in the river, competing with other bears for the fattest salmon. Or perhaps he was deep in the pine forest, foraging for berries before winter's onset. The memory of that second, surreal encounter, man and bear in the early dawn, the gentle nudge on Hank's hand, reminded Hank of how much we share with the creatures of this planet. A sense of wonder dwelled in him that never again faded. Occasionally, Hank returned to the cabin in hopes of catching another glimpse of Bo. Sometimes he found fresh tracks near the water's edge that matched a large adult bear, though he never again experienced such a close, deliberate interaction. This was fitting. Their reunion, brief but intense, was enough of a miracle. The battered leather collar remained in Hank's trunk, a relic of a time when a tiny orphaned cub needed human help to survive. Now, that same cub roamed free, a testament to adaptability and resilience. Hank liked to think that their story might inspire others to respect nature, to protect the habitats that allowed creatures like Bo to flourish. On a late summer day, a group of college students visited the park, and Hank, guiding them, spoke of compassion and responsibility. He described how bears in Katmai taught him lessons about humility and grace. Without naming names, he alluded to having cared for a cub many years back. One student asked, "Do you think the bear remembers you?" Hank paused, recalling the hush of that dawn, the gentle bump of a muzzle against his hand, and the rumbling chuff that seemed to say, "I know you." "Sometimes," Hank replied, his voice trembling with gratitude. "I think they remember far more than we give them credit for." And with that, he led the young men and women onward, deeper into the park, the wind whispering through tall grasses, the rivers brimming with salmon. Somewhere out there, Bo wandered, and in Hank's heart, the echo of their bond glowed, a quiet, steady flame, lighting the path to a deeper understanding of connection, love, and the unbreakable thread that once joined a man and an orphaned bear cub in one of the wildest corners of the world.